history author.
No, we're not. You know, this is for independence special.
So but any day want to discuss any author, you meet me.
Your book. We can discuss your book.
You know, I'm more into critical scholarly writings.
You can look at any author.
That's my biggest contribution then to African literary scholarship. It's a work almost everybody who is a scholar in Africa. My name is Udenta Udenta, and I consider myself a being of many parts, which means I cut my teeth in scholarship as an academic, who taught at Abia State University literally for 10 years, and then combined within that same period, active, indeed acute participation in the democratization processes of the 1990s as a civil society leader and a champion of human rights. I functioned essentially under Eastern Mandate Union, which radicalized the space of the East in terms of demarginalization and then reanimating the democratic order by de-annulling the June 12 election that Abiola won. And then crucially under NADECO, which was the umbrella platform that brought together the leading lies of Nigerian pro-democracy struggle. Suffered detention 6 times, was released when Abacha died by former head of state Abu Salami Abubakar. Went on to become the National Secretary of Alliance for Democracy. Subsequently worked in government, and an independent consultant who just issued 21 books last year, bringing together the works I did as a teenager, I call them boyhood works, then my early scholarly works, beginning with visionary extensions and African literary projects, and culminating with my latest contribution in terms of literary and cultural scholarship titled Crisis of Theory in Contemporary Nigerian Literature and the Possibilities of a Materialist recovery or direction of that literature. So in essence, this is who Udenta is. You can see the space I've covered. I've covered the space of academia, the space of civil society agitation, pro-democracy engagement, space of managing a political party. I function as a bureaucrat in government, in a government institution, Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution, for 8 years as a director, initially for the whole of the world and Africa, then finally in Nigeria. Our biggest contribution as a director, my team, myself and my team, is what we call the strategic conflict assessment, the first ever effort to conceptualize the notion of mapping Nigerian conflict, domesticating the defeat, this British defeat, methodology in conflict assessment with a unique approach of trying to harmonize the incredible spirit and resources and tools of Nigerian non-state civil society actors. We produce that work. And then the early warning, strategies we try to develop for the country. These are 2 standout contributions of my team and myself when I was a director in that institute. So it's essentially.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
Now, the likes of you in Africa, I know you know a lot of them, and you know their contributions to freedom in Africa, and then their continuous watch, on our democracy.
Yes, absolutely.
So we would like you to, give us a rundown of what African writers have done to make sure we are free from colonial rule.
Okay.
And then after that,
what
have they been doing
to sustain that tempo of a decolonization and so on? When you look at the notion of periodization, of our history, you find that the theoretical construct that really comes to my mind is that is a construct formulated by a scholar named, Frederick Jameson. So Jameson actually came up with this theory that you can periodize a history. That history of periodizing could be linear in nature, but that periodization too could be ruptured, which means it can have colonial, pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial. That's almost like a linear construction of history. But then within this linearity, you find ruptures. For example, the Civil War. For example, military coup d'etats, and interregnums. Maybe the Niger Delta situation, now Boko Haram. These are ruptures of history. But if you look at the way it started, in the 30s and the 40s, and then the 1950s, when the likes of Achebe, began to transgress against not just the sociology of colonialism, but the statics of colonialism. As a student of literature, you know what is called the so-called universal critical criteria or literary criteria. This is the means and ways or the mode of constructing a static product. So the production of literature must follow a certain pattern. People like Achebe, Ngugi Watingo, and Wole Soyinka transgressed upon it, subverted this mode. That's why Achebe became a standout creator, because of the unique use of language and then the restoration of the humanity of the African. He used the Igbo word as a subset of the African universe. And of course, his numerous teachings and numerous speeches and papers, he talked about, the influence of maybe James Carey, influence of who wrote Mr. Johnson, influence of Joseph Conrad and Heart of Darkness, try to diminish that human space in Africa, try to see Africa from that primitive notion of people, uncivilized, almost unreconstructed in terms of historical progress. He tried to humanize, to retrieve the humanity of the African. So that contribution is what generally now is recognized as cultural nationalism. The cultural nationalists of that period of the late 40s, 50s, and maybe early 60s. You find the works of Tiama Luko, Kamuangwo, John Mununye, of course, Soyinka. And these are all, fictive imagination. They are creators of fictional works. If you look at the dramatic, compositions, you find that even Wole Soyinka's A Dance of the Forest became the independence play. But that work, bestrides the domain of colonialism, the domain of post-coloniality, because while he talks about the humanity of the African, just like Achebe did with his Things Fall Apart, he talks too about the gathering of the tribes, almost as if I'm seeing a picture that is not very pleasant. These guys who coming together in the nationalists at the political frontier, who wanted to topple colonialism, may not really, be fully alert to the challenges, to the deep institutional and structural challenges of the post-colony. And if care is not taken, this gathering of tribes may persist for a long while, which means rather than having a coherent and cohesive nation state with a sense of belonging for everybody, you may just have a squabbling group of people. Unfortunately, for 60 years, Nigeria still remains a squabbling group of individuals and nationalities, rent by fault lines that are increasingly getting, far more agitated than before. Now, take your mind back at early period. I read one piece by our unfortunately late Pius Adesami. He talked about post-nation, new literatures, new leadership, and so on, where he saw, in the third generation writers, as having uttered something new. For him, the status of the third generation is the only newness you find in Nigerian literature. And I said, no, as brilliant as Adesami, was, you should understand the newness of that first generation. Because when you look at Things Fall Apart from the prison of 2017 or 18 or 2020, you will not see the remarkable achievement of that period when the notion of even African humanity was lost. So the very fact of recuperating or reanimating that humanity to say, we are not like one long line of savagery, our past, but it was noble but imperfect. That could be the thesis you have to draw to your heart and say, they contributed as much as the second and third generation in creating a new sense of our national literature that is a transgression against the received universal criteria of the Eurocentric and Euromodernist mind or consciousness and created something uniquely African. But within that broad spectrum of struggle and contribution to decolonization, you find two strands. The liberal humanist, who almost aligned, with the political nationalist, the agitators like Nnamdi Azikiwe, Obafemi Awolowo, and the rest of them. You find some level of harmony between them and the works of maybe Soyinka and the works of, say, maybe Chinua Achebe or maybe Tiama Luko and so on. There's a battle at the political front to salvage the nation state, rescue from colonialism. There's a cultural struggle, to recover, reanimate, and recuperate African cultural practices, spiritual practices, philosophical systems, indigenous knowledge formation systems destroyed by colonialism. But you find a radical approach to it. Ngugi started as a liberal humanist with his very first works of, The River Between, Weep Not Child, and then his plays like The Black Habit, This Time Tomorrow, and so on. Up until you can call he's a grain of wheat some sort of work that is part liberal humanist, part visionary aesthetics. But if you go to a play of his like the Prof didn't Kemati, you find it's almost not just a negation of colonialism, but a negation of post-coloniality. He's looking at this as a struggle of the masses, of the proletarian class, of the working people, against against on the one hand, the colonial oppressors, and two, the indigenous collaborators of colonialism. That's a far more radical approach in terms of understanding what the struggle was then. And that is why Ngugi, for me, attained the apogee in terms of an artistic producer who lived the life of a trenchant opponent of colonialism and misgovernance of the post-colonial period. Not just as a producer of cultural texts, but equally a producer of living history. When they set up the Kamiriti Education and Cultural Center, the masses themselves chose a play. The script came out from their own collective, communal participation in the production of that drama, which was called Udenta, I Will Marry When I Want. And the play became their own product against both foreign reaction, foreign imperialism and local reaction. For them, the very powerful, terms called the comprador bourgeois class, the petit bourgeois elite of the African post-colonies that worked and functioned as home guard chiefs during the colonial period, that fought the Mau Mau, the African resistance movement, to a standstill, that got independence from the British as they collaborated with imperialists. So Ngugi's, assault on their own humanity, you find that in a great measure in, Devil on the Cross, Petals of Blood, Ngaika Udenta, Tribe Leader Kemati, Mother Sing For Me, Matigari, and Wizard of the Crown, so on. Achebe, of course, has issue with Ngugi in terms of the ideologization of aesthetics, which is the more doctrine the vision of Ngugi becomes, the more the looseness of the artistic mood. That's one of Achebe's problems. But then this is a debate within writers and scholars. Because one can say, Achebe, what did you write during Biafra? You were just like laid back, constructing your beautiful aesthetic pieces, beautiful language, bringing the Igbo folk tale, the proverbial wisdom into the narrative artifice in a successful way. But when Biafra came and you're part of that Biafran struggle, you now harmonize your art with the resistance. The Biafran resistance became streamed and centralized in Achebe's art. So for him, then he could speak about, the mission of the African writer is a mission to support the Biafran revolutionary struggle. And then talk about the case of Chris Okimbo, who abandoned his high profession as a recounter, as a voice of poetry, as an aesthetic producer, to become a combatant. Of course, that ended in a sharp rebuke from Ali Mazore, who wrote The Trial of Chris Okimbo. Do we really find an artist who have to live the life of art for art's sake, as his calling, as the only domain of legitimacy? Do we find the artist who crosses the threshold of art into the domain of social practice? Has something been lost by the African writer in confronting the oddities of post-colonial, misgovernance, to abandon that craft and participate and engage in the field of contestation of politics and ideology? That's the kind of thing I find, growing. But if I had to rebalance the discussion to be much more coherent, I can say in summary here is that colonialism produced its antithesis, which is the resistance to it. And that resistance took different forms and shapes: the political, the economic, even the mass-based, like you found, in Algeria, in South Africa, and then in several other parts of the continent, and the more benign constitutional framework in terms of getting our independence, which you find in Nigeria. And then you find that art equally reflected that fixed period of, indigenous art formation in the modern contemporary space, reflected these tendencies. The cultural nationalists, the liberal humanists who participated or contributed, toward the incredible task of recovering our humanity and then pushing back the frontiers of colonialism. And then in the second period, when or the so-called post-independence disillusionment, the post-colony did not perform. Actually, the leaders underwhelmed. And they find that the same writers who had a tenuous solidarity or some sort of putative notion of oneself with the political elite diverged because of the promises of independence and post-colonial governance. Those promises began to be toppled and subverted by the leaders to crass ambition, electoral manipulations and fraud, ethnic strife, and so on. The writers recoiled within themselves and said, that's not what we fought for. That's what we contributed our intellectual and aesthetic abilities, to achieving. And they turned almost as the case may be, against their partners in the anti-colonial nationalist, national liberation struggle. And writers like Achebe begin to write works like, Man of the People, and before then, no longer